thank you very much. First of all, thank you for the invitation to come to the workshop and give this presentation. And actually, I should thank Nancy as well, who persuaded me to come. And I'm actually glad that I came, because I thought there were some quite interesting talks already this morning. I missed most of it yesterday and Monday, but at least this morning was really very interesting, I found. Good, and now we are changing a little bit the topic, coming from medical and biological systems now. Well, it's also biology, but now more to the carbon cycle. And I'd like to give you a brief overview of what we are talking about for the next 30 minutes or so. So first of all, I want to introduce the topic and then say a few words about the methodology, the carbon cycle data assimilation system. Give some examples of multiple constraints on the carbon cycle using different kinds of observations, and a problem which we've seen quite frequently is this non-convergence problem, and what we think is a solution to this non-convergence problem, and then conclude. So since this is a quite diverse audience here, I thought I bring up a sketch of the global carbon cycle, which is very simplistic, but you get the main idea. So we have, essentially we have three components or compartments. So that's the atmosphere, which, where you have carbon dioxide as a constituent in the atmosphere, has a specific amount of CO2, which is, well, don't look at the numbers or don't take them too serious. They are a few years old. And then the atmosphere exchanges CO2 with land, mainly through photosynthesis, so uptake of CO2 by the plants, and then release by respiration, either from the plants directly or by decomposition of organic materials, so that's a soil respiration. And then the third component is the ocean, which exchanges CO2 as well with the atmosphere, so that's a physiochemical diffusion. On top of this natural system, we have the anthropogenic perturbation, and that's actually why we care about this. So we burn fossil fuel, we release atmospheric anthropogenic CO2 to the atmosphere, and thereby increasing the atmospheric CO2 content. And since CO2 is a greenhouse gas, it has effects on the global climate, and that's essentially, well, to cut a long story short, it's a global change problem. So CO2 is a greenhouse gas, and by adding these anthropogenic CO2 to the atmosphere, we are increasing the atmospheric CO2 level and the greenhouse gas potential. So what we are focusing on now here is the terrestrial part of the terrestrial atmospheric exchange part here. So I'm going to show you some data assimilation experiments with the exchange between land and atmosphere of CO2. And the land is in particular interesting, and I'm coming to that in a second, because it's most variable. Here's a sort of a different picture of the carbon cycle. On the left-hand side, we have the anthropogenic perturbation. So it's mainly the fossil fuel burning, but it's of course also land use change, or the land use, which is releasing some emissions to the atmosphere, but only about half of the emissions stay in the atmosphere, and the other half is taken up by land and ocean. And you can see already here, we have a pretty good knowledge of the atmospheric CO2 content, so there the errors are fairly small. But it looks different when we go to land and ocean, and especially on land, uncertainties are the largest. That's one of the reasons why we are most interested in land-atmosphere exchange. Another reason is, and that's now showing here the dynamics of the system. So we have now here is on the x-axis and the flux on the y-axis. We have the anthropogenic perturbation here again, which you can see is also increasing during time. But what I want to show you here is that the uptake by the land is much more variable than the uptake by the ocean. So the ocean is fairly stable through time, whereas the land really changes, and that's due to actually the climate fluctuations. And you can see even instances where, for example, this is 1988, 89, where the land has been a source instead of a sink. And that's due to different, well, essentially to the different weather during that specific year. So there was a strong El Nino year, and therefore the biosphere, well, therefore the weather patterns were different, and the biosphere acted slightly differently. So that's essentially the reason why I focus here on the land and want to try to estimate the land carbon fluxes. There are a couple of models who are actually simulating this land atmosphere flux. So these are the green lines here. And, well, you can immediately see that the range of the simulations is larger than the black line is here. The mean value is larger than the mean value. So there's a huge uncertainty from these models in predicting the flux from the land to the atmosphere. One of the reasons is because all of these models are essentially unconstrained. They have been tuned, hand-tuned to observations, but not rigorously through a mathematical approach like data assimilation. But on the other hand, we have a lot of observations which we can use and can make use of to actually constrain these models and then get a hopefully better prediction of the land atmosphere flux of CO2. So that's the reason for doing or for building a carbon cycle data assimilation system. So we do have knowledge about the processes. So we have ecophysiological constraints from the forward modeling. And on the other hand, we have lots of information which we can use, lots of observations of different types which are relevant for the land atmosphere CO2 flux. So how does the method work? The CCDAS, carbon cycle data assimilation system methodology. It's based, or the system I'm using is based on a process-based terrestrial ecosystem model. So going back, it's one of these lines here. It's called Bethy. The system optimizes, or the model has many parameters, but in the system we're optimizing about 100 parameters based on information about the gradient of the model, which is then calculated through the adjoint model. So we have the adjoint of the Bethy model. And then we also have the second derivative, so the Hessian, which we then use to estimate the posterior parameter uncertainties on the parameters. And then with these posterior parameter uncertainties, we actually can use a linearized model to propagate errors forward to any quantity we are interested in. So essentially, of course, as a terrestrial biosphere modeler, I'm interested in the parameters, but for example, policymakers or also climate modelers are more interested in the fluxes. So we need to propagate uncertainties onto the fluxes. And here's a simple sketch showing essentially the two modi of the system. So first we have a calibration mode where we use the observations to calibrate the parameters and get some posterior information on the parameters. And with that information, we can then run the model and diagnose the terrestrial biosphere, the carbon fluxes, or if we have appropriate driving data for the model, we can actually even run it since it's a process-based model, we can run it in a prognostic mode. So process parameters, a few words about process parameters. They are invariant in time, so they don't change over time. Otherwise, they wouldn't be process parameters in my understanding. The parameterizations are in biological systems, as we have it here, are often based on semi-empirical relationships. So there's not always a fundamental theory behind it. So they are, we've seen this morning as well, these Michaelis-Menten equations, which are semi-empirical relationships. So there's no fundamental physical theory behind it. And that always leads to the effect that these parameters are specific for some plant species. However, the model doesn't simulate all the plant species on the world. That would be a bit too much. And even, I think, with a K computer, it would be computationally not feasible to model all plant species. But it lumps the species together in functional types. And through this lumping, we need to lump also the parameters together. And that's this upscaling process is highly uncertain. So different sketch which shows essentially the approach. So at the core of the system, we have the model, which has some input and boundary conditions. So that's the plant functional type composition, for example, and the climate to drive the model. Then it simulates the counterpart. So it includes the observation operators for the observations. And I've highlighted here 4 different types of observations. So that's the CO2 exchange directly, which can be measured through these towers, then atmospheric CO2 and satellite data of either vegetation activity or soil moisture. And then this is combined in a single cost function, which has an observational part and a parameter part here. And it's formulated in the Bayesian framework. Then, of course, what we need to know are the errors on both the observations and the parameters. Observations usually come with the error estimate. Parameters we derive from literature or laboratory studies. And this is showing you a sketch of the model. So it has different compartments or different modules. So it's solving the energy with water balance, it calculates photosynthesis, has a phenology model, and a carbon balance model. It's a highly nonlinear model, quite complex. There are many different, logarithmic equations or these Michaelis-Menten relationships, which makes it sometimes a bit difficult to use in a data assimilation framework. So now, looking at observations, so one of the best observations we have are the atmospheric CO2 network, and the points are showing you some of the locations. I've highlighted 3 here. So Mauna Loa is the most famous one, which I guess everyone knows. Then there's a site at South Pole and another one in the high latitudes, which is Point Barrow. And I show some pictures of it. Well, actually, no. So that's Point Barrow, just to illustrate how it looks like. So there we have a flat terrain, and that's the observational site. They go out and really have a glass flask, which they fill with air and then ship to a laboratory to measure. Oops, that was too quickly. That's Mauna Loa on top of a volcano on Hawaii, one of the islands of the Hawaiian Islands. And that's South Pole, so that's on the Antarctic continent. Now, how does it look like? So that's the Mauna Loa curve. The black line is the measured values. We see this transient increase through the combustion of fossil fuels. Our model assumes a neutral biosphere as a first guess, as a prior. So that's why we are completely off in the first guess. And we don't simulate the terrestrial uptake. But then after the optimization, that's a red line now, we actually fit the Mauna Loa curve quite nicely. And it's not only the trend now, but you can also see that we do get the interannual variability. If you look closely, there's some interannual variability, and the seasonal cycle is also improved. This is now showing South Pole, and you see a very different seasonality. So just to illustrate the problem, here the seasonality is mainly influenced by the vegetation activity, whereas at South Pole there's not much vegetation, so that's why you see only a very little variability through the seasons. And that's actually sort of a test to see if our, what we call background fluxes, which we don't simulate, so for example ocean uptake, are working, because that's mainly the ocean which we see at South Pole. Now, I mentioned that we have the Hessian as well to approximate the posterior uncertainties, parameter uncertainties. We get the full matrix and also the error covariances. And that's actually quite interesting as a diagnostic to look at. That's an example of one parameter which is specific for some plant types. And if you look here for this Vmax for C3 grass and crops, it's actually, we get a fairly high covariance here. And if you think about where C3 grasslands, so that's mainly grasslands, and crops, well, that's croplands, where they are located, they're usually co-located, and by using just atmospheric CO2 measurements, observations cannot distinguish between these two PFTs, these two plant types. That's why we get these error covariances. And then on the bottom, that's a plot showing the relative error reduction. So that's a reduction of 1 here, or value of 1 would mean that we know the value perfectly well, and 0 means we don't improve on the value here. And we see that these are only 57 parameters, a slightly different setup, but we see that only some of the parameters are constrained and not all of them by using just one type of measurements. And then that's the propagation of the posterior parameter errors onto the fluxes. So that's an example of the flux per grid cell here, and that's the associated uncertainty. And then one can, of course, calculate regional means, for example, for continental or large countries, and then also estimate the errors on these means here. Now, how does it look like with a multiple constraint? And that's a graph showing you where we used not only CO2 flask measurements, but also these remotely sensed satellite data. So FA-par, that's essentially the fraction of absorbed photosynthetic active radiation. So giving you an idea of the vegetation activity, how much of the light is used for photosynthesis. And since the carbon cycle is tightly coupled to the water cycle, one can also use remotely sensed soil moisture observations. And here is an example of the FA-par assimilation for one site in Finland, where you can see the observations as triangles. The prior is a red line, and the blue is the posterior line. And then there's also a magenta line, which is assimilating the data from a different site, so actually from this site, and using then the parameters for this site here, Hytila. So we see when we assimilate data on one side, we learn something also for our other sites, and the same is shown here. So that's a transfer of information since we have a process-based model in space, but also we can do that between variables. So that's the variable we assimilate, and here that's the photosynthetic flux, and we also see that if we assimilate only the vegetation activity information, we learn about the photosynthesis as well. And essentially, this picture is showing the same, but now using the atmospheric CO2 concentration and not the FA-par, the vegetation activity, where we assimilate data here from Mauna Loa and South Pole. So again, the green line is the prior, the blue line is the optimized, and the reds are showing the observations. And these are the results from 2 stations which we didn't use, but have observations from. So again, we also fit the data, although we don't use the data. So it's checking that the system works. And then we can actually look at the global land flux for, now you just need to concentrate on the circles here for the different experiments and the different constraints from the data. So only the atmospheric CO2 data, or atmospheric CO2 and soil moisture, or FA-par, or all 3 together. And you see that it actually does make a difference, which kind of data we assimilate and how many data we assimilate. So if we only do CO2, we see a large offset between the different circles, whereas if we assimilate more data, they are usually closer together. So we get a stronger constraint. As a second example of a multiple constraint, it's a slightly different setup just for one site, which is measuring the fluxes. So there we use the latent heat flux and also the FA power observations. It's an optimization of 24 parameters. Since there are only two plant functional types, there are only 24 parameters. And here's a fit to the data for the latent heat flux. So black are observations, blue is the prior, and then it's either the latent heat flux or the FA power data assimilated in orange and green, or the combined. And you can see that actually, well, the fit to the latent heat flux is best when latent heat flux is assimilated. The same is true using the different data stream, the FA power data stream. You can also see when assimilating FA power only, the fit is best. But when assimilating both data and assimilating latent heat flux here, the fit is worst. So it's even worse than the prior. And when one assimilates both observational streams, we get a somehow in-between result. The most interesting part is then if we look at the parameter uncertainty reduction. So here the black and the white bars are just for the single constraint, and the shaded bar is for the combined constraint. And you can see it best here for the first two parameters, which are regulating the photosynthesis, that if we assimilate only one data stream, there's a little uncertainty reduction. But if we assimilate both data streams, so have a multiple constraint, we get a much higher uncertainty reduction than the sum of the two. So that's because of the non-linearities in the model. Now, one of the problems I mentioned earlier is the problem of convergence and robustness of the solution. So what we tried is to start the assimilation from many different starting points, so many different prior parameter values. And they end up, that's the cost function value, that's the number of iterations. And we see that they end up on different points in parameter space. And I've picked up 2 points here, so that's most likely a global minimum. Some of them don't even reach a minimum, where the gradient is still considerably large and not going down to 0. And this is another minimum here. So if we compare those minima, we actually do get very different parameter values. And one of the reasons, and of course, we have a large number of non-converging experiments. So what we then thought of is to try to simplify the system for the variational approach, to use only the part where we are sure that it converges, and use an ensemble approach for the remaining part of the model. And that's sort of the setup here. So we start some ensemble runs here, which are calculating the photosynthesis, because we found out that that's the part which is causing the problems. Do an ensemble of 200 runs. Then use output of this ensemble runs for the assimilation system, which is now focusing only on the carbon balance part, which is the one which converged. And then superimpose the PDFs, which are coming out of the assimilation system, to one PDF at the end. So since it's now a slightly simplified problem, we only have 19 parameters to optimize here, and the rest of the parameters are taken care of in the ensemble generation. So this is showing you, well, we then used 117 out of the 70 out of the 200 members, because there were still some convergence problems. So we discarded 30 runs. And this is now showing you the spectra of the cost function over the runs. And well, we do get the minimum solution, but we have a peak here, which is a bit out of the minimum. And if we now superimpose all the PDFs for the parameters, so these are the blue lines, the individual PDFs from the assimilation and the ensemble. And the red line is the superimposed, and the green line is the Gaussian approximation. We actually see that we can approximate the PDFs quite nicely with the Gaussian. And then from there, we can even go to the use the linearization of the model and propagate the Gaussian error, propagate the posterior errors, and again fit a Gaussian to the superimposed results. So here the blue lines are the individual ensemble runs again. The red is the superimposed PDF resulting from the individual ensemble runs. The green is the Gaussian approximation, and the black line is actually the base case, where we use the full CC dust setup, the full variational setup for the whole model. And one thing which we see is that when we do that, we actually do underestimate the uncertainty, posterior uncertainty considerably, because we don't have the full uncertainty range which comes from the photosynthesis part of the model. And by that, I'd like to summarize. So first, we have a assimilation system for the carbon cycle, which is a mathematically rigorous combination of process understanding and observations, where we can constrain the model against observations. It provides then an integrated view, taking into account several data streams on the carbon cycle, on all variables that can be simulated by the model at any time and place. So we can actually propagate information from one place to another and from one time to another time. So we can prognose carbon fluxes, calculate regional scale budgets with the combination of the multiple data streams. And then the added value of multiple data streams is actually quantified through the uncertainty reduction on the parameter. So we saw that actually the sum when the uncertainty reduction, the uncertainty reduction using multiple data streams is larger than the sum of the individual uncertainty reductions. And of course, the system can be extended to include further data streams. So you can use actually any data stream where you can build a observation operator for. And then, as a final conclusion, I showed this what we call hierarchical parameter estimation, where we actually separated parts of the model where we found that they would not converge within a variational system, and use an ensemble approach for this part, and then combine that with a variational approach in the system. And then superimpose the individual PDFs from the ensemble and the target quantities to obtain final PDFs, giving you a more realistic estimation of the final uncertainties. Thank you.